So here I'm going to be talking about some labour rights issues in our medical supply chains. This is an area I've been working on since 2006. So, as we see and have heard about free market economics in many other supply chains, such as for our garments and for our agricultural products, where we've got these global value chains, we outsource a lot of the production or growth of our products and we bring them in. That also exists in healthcare, and it was something of a surprise to me when I first started in this. We don't have great transparency in our supply chain, so we're not sure how big free market economics works, but certainly I'll show you some examples of this. So here's an example from some guards being produced for patients with rheumatological disease, supports in Mexico. They're coming off this production line and then they're going into 6 different boxes. The brand, as you can see here on your right, is a US company that's no longer trading. And on the other side, on your left, is a local Mexican brand. It's exactly the same product going into each of these boxes. So these are global value chains. Where can I make this the cheapest and send it to where it needs to be? The problem with global value chains is, of course, we're not always necessarily asking what sort of conditions these products are made under, and cost is often a big pressure. So as we've seen with other global value chains, many global value chains, this also is present in our medical supply chains. It's difficult to know how big this problem is because we don't really have transparency of our supply chains. We still don't know where the majority of our goods are manufactured. And we've tried to get this data by looking around. So our colleagues in Norway actually had a contractual obligation to suppliers to over 29,000 products that were supplied to the Norwegian health system, asking, where are your products made? And we also did some work with some colleagues in Cambridge looking at where products were manufactured. We then mapped that to country of origin according to the International Trade Union Confederation ranking of risk of labour abuse in a country. So it's not perfect because we're not saying we know everything, but this is a risk. And what we found is, on average, around half of all of our medical products, where we could find that information, are manufactured in countries with high risk of labour rights abuse. Some examples. PPE, which became very big during the pandemic, and just look at the volumes. The gloves volumes prior to the pandemic in the NHS in England were 1.7 billion per year. And I've calculated, if you were to put those end to end, that would almost stretch to the moon. That's a lot of gloves, and of course, all we ask about is price, and it's outsourced manufacture. PPE increase during the pandemic was phenomenal, as you'd expect. Several thousand-fold increases. But nobody was really asking where this was manufactured. But we did some work, and we've looked at some of the manufacturing areas, and these are investigations by journalists who've shown, for example, this manufacturing company, Top Glove, the world's largest manufacturer, although these were all looks like a great factory, in reality, these are all migrant workers who brought in from countries such as Bangladesh and Nepal. And although things seem okay on the shop floor, when you go behind the scenes, these workers have paid large recruitment fees to unscrupulous agents. Typically $2,000 is what we found, sometimes up to $5,000, which is a huge amount of work. There are people who have sold their land for this opportunity to come and work in this factory. In reality, what we find is that conditions are not what you might expect. So here are some videos. The video on your left shows a worker having an altercation with their manager and not being dealt with appropriately. The video on the right is showing a manufacture of some gloves supplied into the UK health system as well as systems around the world. And these workers were living in shipping containers. Their entire existence for several years, typically 3 years, was to live in a shipping container and be transported by a factory-owned bus to go and work in this factory, typically 12 hours a day, every single day. And they felt trapped because they have to pay off the large recruitment fees that they've already forked out. Now, some of these conditions have got better, but it's still endemic. And you can read our report looking at all of these gloves manufacturers in Malaysia who are found to have serious forced labour concerns in their manufacture. It's not just gloves. We've found evidence we know of from other journalists that some of the masks that were being manufactured and supplied to healthcare systems, both in the UK and the US, were manufactured using forced Uyghur labour in China. That is in the northwest of China, where there has been forced indoctrination, effectively, of this group, which the UN itself has classified as genocide, subject to physical and sexual abuse if they do not comply with what the state requires. We are purchasing these and we are funding this. We also see this with other PPE, but also drapes, textiles that we might use in healthcare. So here's another media report where gowns coming into the National Health Service were again manufactured in China, in the northeastern part, and the labourers there were from North Korea, where between 70 and 100% of their salary was sent back to the North Korean state. Again, this is state-sponsored forced labour, and we have funded it. And that's what happens when you create a disposable supply chain and we don't ask questions about where things are produced. Metal instruments. In the NHS, we purchase around 52 million single-use metal instruments. It's become the norm in places such as accident and emergency departments, where suture kits are used once and thrown away. Laryngoscope blades used to put patients to sleep, used once and thrown away. And other areas such as outpatient clinics, where we might use metal instruments to examine, inspect or perform a procedure and then thrown away. That's because perhaps we don't have the infrastructure to enable reuse, or because we think, oh, actually it's just cheaper to throw everything away. But of course, again, when we're pushing the prices, you may be interested here that 70% of all the world's surgical instruments are produced in a town called Sialkot in the north of Pakistan, under what can only be described as sweatshop labour conditions, with workers working with heat, noise, dust, and potentially suffering, and I've seen this, serious injuries on these machines, typically paid between $1 and $2 a day, which is an inadequate wage to live on. It's not just surgical instruments, everything else we outsource. Diathermy forceps, there's your laryngoscope blades. These blades are actually being welded by teenagers, and in fact, of the 50,000 labourers that work in this area, we know that several thousand are children. Now, there have been efforts made by the Pakistani government and by the International Labour Organization to reduce this, but this is a symptom of an unhealthy practice in the way we buy things and how we reward and recognise those people making these products for us, and a failure to recognise what happens if you just throw everything away and the cheapest price is all you ever want. Children typically start at the age of 12, but there are children as young as 7. And if you interview them, they hate this work. They don't want to do this work. Of course, they want to go to school and they want to play cricket in the streets. So this is an unhealthy supply chain. It's a symptom of how we created a linear economy, which you will hear about in some of the other talks. It is this disassociation from the manufacturer, who's often separate to the supplier, who then sells on to those that want to buy this product, then the user, and then the consumer. And this fragmented supply chain means that we don't really have visibility or necessarily responsibility or indeed the ability to change things. And the consequences are both labour harms, environmental damage from throwing things away, a lack of resilience in our supply chains, because in fact we don't have all the products we need. We saw that during the pandemic. And actually economic costs. The economic modelling has been really old-fashioned, and what we find is actually if you reuse, you usually save money. So let's create healthier supply chains, and let's enable that through having a mature approach to infection control, through having a rebuilding of the infrastructure we need to reuse equipment, and increasing the resilience in our supply chains and having true economic models of the cost of this. We've done some work on labour rights, and I'm glad to say there has been some changes. For example, with people I work with, we've had over $150 million repaid to workers in those gloves factories, and working conditions are improving. We should continue to ask those questions, because this is about human health and human dignity as much as our planet.